Well, welcome everybody. Can't believe it's already the last afternoon of the conference. This couple of days has just flown by. I'm Lisa Battle. I am the president and one of the principal consultants at Design for Context. We are a small UX consultancy in the Washington, D.C. area. And I'm here to talk today about dashboards. So without further ado, let's see if the clicker works. Yep. OK. So dashboards. I'm going to start with the one that we all see most often, right? This is the one in our car. So every day, part of our driving experience, an important thing that we do is to check this frequently, I think, to see how we're doing. The dashboard in our car is going to tell us important things like, are we going the speed limit or are we going too fast? How soon do I need to get gas again? How many miles I might have left before my tank is empty, and if there's anything wrong with the car, such as running out of gas, or I have a door unlocked, or anything like that. The dashboard will hopefully give me some important indicators of that so that I can take care of any problems before they go further. Looks like we're having a problem with the slides. Anybody in AV know what to do with this? There's other dashboards that are a lot more complicated than this. This is an example from the flight cockpit where people have a lot of detail that they have to absorb, so a lot more complicated than what we use in our cars. But of course, it's also contextually appropriate, and this is an audience that has a lot of specialized knowledge, so that's something that they do. OK, so while he's moving that, who here is working on an application that has a dashboard in it? Raise your hand. All right, a lot of us. What about, are you working on an application that does not have a dashboard, but you think it might need one? Anybody there? OK, got a few of them. Cool. So for those of you who think you might need a dashboard, can you say briefly why? Like, why do you think you might need one?
Because there's no way to bubble up important things that people need to see first when they enter the application.
Right, OK, so she says no way to bubble up things that people really need to see when they first get into the application. OK, Caroline, go for it. So she's gotten rid of her dashboard and she's going to replace it with a better one. That's great. What else? So let's talk about some of the things that the questions that dashboards can answer for us. So in typical SaaS applications and enterprise applications, there are things that people need to know to do their work. What's some examples of questions that a dashboard can answer? Anybody? I know this is a big room. It's hard to do this. What's that? System status? OK. Yeah, that's a good one. What about things that I need to focus on? Could be problems I need to solve, like things that are going wrong. Could be work that I need to do in a workflow system. Could be indicators of how the business is going. So when let's see, he's signaling. Are we back? All right. So that was the cockpit. So this is just a quick example of what dashboards were. I don't know, back in the 90s or something. The KPIs is what people used to call this: the key performance indicators, business intelligence. Let the executives see a few graphics that kind of indicate how the business is doing, how sales are going, how the profit margins are, and stuff like that. So I think we've evolved from this a little bit, and I'm going to talk about now what goes into a dashboard today. So as we've just talked about, a dashboard is a starting point for some of the things that users need to do. I think it can be a starting point for key tasks. It can be a way to see the trends that are happening in my business. It can be my to-do list. So for many workflow applications, it's stuff that I need to process, and then I'm going to pass it on to the next person, and they're going to do things with it as well. It could be things I need to approve. Includes things like recent activity, things that I've done recently or things that other people have done recently so that I'm aware of them. So then this kind of raises the question of what is not a dashboard. And I like to have counter examples as well. So I'll share a few of these with you. And it's funny, I've started having these debates with my colleagues about, is that a dashboard? Is that really a dashboard? So I will try to convey some of that thinking as well. So this is an example of something that a friend of mine uses who's a travel agent. And she says that, in the organization that she works with, they rolled out this great new dashboard. They did a lot of publicity about it. And she says, wait a minute, is that a dashboard? So why would I maybe question whether it is a dashboard or not?
Just navigation.
Right, it's just navigation. It's like a big menu. There's no data there. There's no statistics or anything, right? So it's kind of just a menu with icons. Here's an example of a dashboard. This is from, let's see, this is the administrator side of a social networking for business kind of application, right? And you can see that there's a dashboard there. It's about 7 links down in a long list of menu items. When I click on that, I see some things across the top. I see people, groups, web feeds, and some numbers. And what turns out what happens is you kind of click across, and these are all static tables. You can't drill down from them. And it's just kind of one of many things. So when I look at this, I think, is this really a dashboard? I kind of think it's a report. I kind of think, a dashboard is often unique. It's often a landing page, the starting place where people go in your application. And in this case, it just isn't that. And it doesn't give a perspective across multiple things. What about this? Is this a dashboard? This is from the Nest. This is a thermostat program. So when I first looked at this, I thought, nah, it's too simple. And then I thought, well, wait, okay. Maybe it is, because it's a thermostat. So what else is it going to tell me? There's actually very limited stuff it can tell me. It has the nice simplicity about it. It is, in fact, telling me what's going on, the heat, what it's set to. It's giving me a way to act on that if I need to take an action on it. So, it's not what I normally think of as a dashboard, but I think it might count. So then there's the question of, does my application need a dashboard? And what I'm thinking about there is that there may be some that don't for good reason, like an application that does one main task, like it tells you the weather or it gives you a feed of something. And those things, there's not necessarily a reason to roll that up. There's not necessarily anything other than that would be an extra click to get down to what I need. And likewise, there's a class of applications that let you create something, like Evernote in this example, or Snagit, or Microsoft Word, or something like that, where you need a way to get to your stuff, the things that you created, but you don't really need like a layer on top of it giving you statistics. On the other hand, a lot of us work with systems like this. This is a kind of a outline of the navigation in a membership management system that we worked on a while back. And so the interesting thing here was that there was 3 levels of navigation to get down to things. Membership management is a kind of complicated thing. There's a lot of different tasks. There might be different roles involved in this. There's timeliness, there's events, and a user got to a blank screen when they first logged in, right? So there were menus, and you had to know which menu to drill down to. This seems like a good candidate for getting a dashboard in there so that people don't have to know where they need to drill down to find the information that they need. And then this is an example that I just think is kind of interesting. It's a login, you land on a welcome page, and they've filled the page with something, but it's just text, and it's not even of interest to the user, right? This is things like your system information and the release notes and stuff like that. So somebody says, well, there has to be something on this page, but it's not user meaningful. So definitely in a situation like that, you want to change this approach and make it something that reflects what users need to know. So I'm going to talk a little bit about dashboard patterns. And I've got a collection of 10 things. The kind of information architect side of me has started categorizing the types of things that I see in dashboards, because I'd like to be able to use that both as a designer and as a researcher. I think there's benefit in being able to kind of have this almost as a checklist in the back of our heads when we're dealing with a new system, a new client, to kind of jog our memory to say, okay, well, what about this? Let's ask some questions about this and see if it's relevant to their work. And also as a designer to kind of collect good practices and bad practices for design. So the first item in the list of patterns is alerts. This is super important in dashboards. Here's an example from a dashboard for a mobile app. And it's a mobile app for somebody who's responsible for paying bills. They've got to approve bills. So you can see at the top of the screen there is 124 bills that they need to approve, but there are 3 of them that are past due. So that's a nice example of where, there's a lot of things that this user needs to do, but it's drawing up, it's bubbling up to the top, some that are maybe more critical so that they get the attention. Here's an example of alerts as a side panel. I believe this is a panel that goes in and out. What I'm liking about this example is it's kind of conveying the idea that there are different alerts with different degrees of urgency about them. So it's using both color and iconography to suggest that there are some things that are kind of a top priority with that stop sign, and then some things that are more secondary with a kind of a yield sign to it. And we can also represent that idea of priority of alerts through the placement of things on the screen. So in this illustration, I'm kind of showing that sometimes the highest priority things really need visible placement at the very top, where they're going to just jump out at you. And other things might be more secondary or can be placed in the context of the information to which they relate. This is an example of something that is called alerts in Mint, but I don't really see it as being alerts in the sense of urgency. It's more alerts in the sense of letting the user know about something that's going on. It's timely information. It's saying your bill of this much is due on this date, or you went over your budget for clothing this month, or something like that. So giving them a little bit of information relevant to them outside of the typical task. This is an example of alerts that I find a little disturbing, so I wanted to share it with you. It's showing alerts at the bottom of the page, which I don't think is a good practice in general. I think we want to usually, if these really are alerts, they should be prominent. Maybe these aren't really alerts. Maybe these are more like system messages. But another thing I noticed about them is that there are apparently 193 items in this list, and you've got to page through them just a few at a time. So that suggests that there's a scalability problem as well, right? So there's, if these are alerts, they probably need to be rolled up into some kind of grouping. They probably need to be given some kind of relative priority weight so you know what to focus on, because with 193 items, there's no way I'm going to read them all, right? So I'm going to overlook something, make sure I don't overlook the important ones. Here's an example of how we did that in a system that we worked on, where there were going to be a lot of alerts, and we knew that. So we rolled them up by type. And so the 12 there indicates that there are 12 loads. This is for a transportation management system. There are 12 loads that have had a cancellation order. That means somebody's got to go in and deal with the fact that this shipment got canceled, right? It's an alert. It's urgent. It has to be taken care of now. But instead of trying to list them all, they're listed by category. So you can go and deal with the cancellations, or you can go in and deal with the late ones, or maybe somebody deals with one and somebody deals with the other, giving you a better way to manage the alerts. To-do items is another pattern. This is an example from a training learning management system. So a learner logs in and they see things they need to take classes on. So these are going to be, it could be required training, could be certification training, whatever. There's a call to action there saying, for each one of those I can enroll in it, or if it's an online course, I can launch it and take it right now. This is another roll-up of to-do items, so that it's indicating that there are to-do items in several different categories. Activities like assign customer rate, assign carrier rate, and some of them are overdue, some of them are nearing due, so it's giving me a sense of how to prioritize. To-do items might also be something like upcoming bills, or something that I can do in Mint is to categorize transactions if I want to, in order to be a better user and get better feedback. Performance statistics means things like progress towards a goal, or an indicator of how well or poorly we're performing in some area of the business. In this example, this is a dashboard from a fundraising application where the user is looking at, I guess, planning for a walkathon or something, and they've raised some money. They've got a ways to go yet to meet their goal. So the progress indicator is letting them know not only how far along they are, but how much time they have left. In this example from transportation management, again, there's a sense here of getting closer and closer to your daily goal. Turns out some people have quotas that they need to meet, whether that's a dollar amount or a number of loads they need to book. So indicators like this can give them a sense of that on several different dimensions. Another example of performance statistics is to tell people how well they're doing as opposed to the average for other people in their role. This is the kind of thing that can sometimes be a motivator. So in this bill payment example, there was a bit of a business concern that it's taking people too long to approve their bills. So a component of the dashboard turned out to be a thing that shows them what their average approval number of days is compared with other people in their role. And performance statistics can also be over time, like a comparison of the number of things that have happened. Now, this example kind of reminds me to mention that the labeling of axes is pretty important when you're showing performance statistics. So especially in a graph, if you show time, make sure that the time periods are labeled, showing whatever the number of things that's being counted on the vertical axis. Current status is something we see a lot in dashboards. This could be something simple like the balances in your accounts. If you've got credit card accounts or savings accounts or whatever type of financial information. It can be counts of things like how many devices do we have in our system. This is from an equipment management system where the people are responsible for maintaining a whole bunch of different handheld devices, and so they need to know how many do they have, and which people are they assigned to, and are any of them needing to be updated, for instance. Visual indicators of status also come into play in dashboards, and this is a nice place to involve graphic designers and people who are good with iconography. This is kind of a familiar way to represent progress. So here we have a list of recent payments, and the question is, has this payment gone through yet, or is it still kind of on the way, right? And so there's the use of both symbols and colors here to convey, it's finished or it's not quite there yet. And sometimes visual indicators of status include things like the trend. Is it increasing or decreasing? So sometimes we see pluses and minuses for that in a dashboard. Sometimes we see little arrows pointing up and down. Sometimes we also use colors. So here's an example with green and red indicating whether the change is going in a positive or negative direction. And I like the little indicators on the side, too. It's a kind of a visualization that shows where does this trend fit within a broader context. So it's giving me some context for the rate that's being shown. And this is an example where symbolism is being used to convey both severity and the trend. So this is a list of security warnings, and if the warning is severe, there's an icon that indicates that, and also something that indicates whether it's increasing or decreasing. Search is something that we see in dashboards. Now, search is, depending on the system, can be kind of a pervasive thing that's always there in the top navigation. But sometimes there's a particular search task that people want to launch from the dashboard as a starting point. So an example of that would be in this travel dashboard, where searching for a customer or searching for a cruise are the two things that the travel agent is most likely to do when they sit down to this system. So having a search there that's a little bit more than a single block, where they can search by reservation number, by name or phone or other things like that, ends up being a useful starting point for them. And in a learning management system, one of the things that a learner might be coming to do is to find some training. And so one block on the dashboard for this user might be to be able to search or browse. So, browse comes into play. Sometimes people don't know exactly what they're looking for or what it's called in the course catalog. So giving them some categories to drill down in can be a valuable use of some space on a dashboard to help them with that task. Task starting points are something that we see on a dashboard a lot. in order to make this work effectively, you do have to prioritize, because probably not every user task deserves to be on the dashboard, right? But key ones, the ones that you think people might be coming there for the most, or that maybe are the most time sensitive, would be good candidates for that. So in this example, this was a larger dashboard for accounts payable, but there was an area on the dashboard specifically devoted to drag and drop, so that if you needed to upload a new bill, it was important to that customer to get it into the system quickly, and it seemed worth having a placement there, both to let people know they could do it, so it was really obvious that there was a place to do that, and also to make it really simple so they didn't have to navigate somewhere else to find that. And here in the mobile device version, you can see there's a couple of tasks at the bottom there. There's submit a bill and check the status of a bill. So again, not every task that the person needs to do is going to be able to fit on a mobile device, but it's definitely, it's worth thinking about which ones are the most important to convey there. In this example, so this is a fairly large region of a dashboard for a financial services company, and the two things that their users are most likely coming here to do is to convert currency from one currency to another. So they're purchasing currency, or else they're making payments through, they have a stack maybe of invoices from foreign suppliers. So this is giving them two very clear starting points for those two different tasks. I threw this example in because the word quick links kind of, I don't know, it always makes me cringe a little bit. I feel like I've been in enough meetings where there are stakeholders who insist that something has to go on the dashboard or on the home page, and so you kind of pile it all into a miscellaneous category and call it quick links. I don't know if you've been in those situations, but I have been more than I care to admit. So it's, I always will question if something looks like kind of a grab bag, is that really the best place to put those things? And which ones are there for a really good business reason or for meeting a user need? And if you end up with a grab bag like that for quick links, you're going to have to prune it occasionally, because otherwise it kind of ends up being a dumping ground, and a lot of things end up there. Social components. So, we find ourselves surrounded by a lot of social sites now, and I can't possibly use all of them, but we've got Facebook and LinkedIn and Tumblr and Instagram and Twitter and all of those things where we constantly get a stream of information from people that we know. And that stream of information and the timeliness of it can be really great and can keep us connected with other people. And I'm seeing more integration of those social components into dashboards as well. So in dashboards, it can be something like this. This is a kind of an intranet site that we use, and it's got a calendar, and then it's got all the things that my colleagues have been doing lately as far as uploading files or creating new workspaces or things like that, so that I can see what's going on. And in some applications, we find that taking that social thing a step further to show performance of a team can be really interesting. Things like sales, brokerage, stuff like that, where it's not just how I'm doing on my job, but how my team is doing and how my team compares with the other teams. And so we find ourselves doing a little bit of social, and there's a gamification aspect of this as well, right? But showing how my team is doing, not just what I've done, but counts and goals, and maybe a leaderboard type of thing that shows where I fit in the ranking, so that I can work on moving up and becoming, more, I don't know, a better salesman and more profitable, something like that. Then there's recent activity. So recent activity could be something as simple as completed training. If I've logged into my learning management system, I might be here to print out a transcript of something I recently did, or to get my grades or something like that. So there's value in showing people things that they recently did, because there might be a follow-up action that they need to take. And sometimes it's worth having that on the dashboard. And similarly in this bill payment application, so there's bills that are waiting for my approval, but then there's also ones that were approved by me recently, and that gives me kind of a quick way in to look at something. So if I just approved something and then realize I made a mistake, I have a way to get in there. Or if I get a call from somebody about something I did yesterday, there's an easy way to get back to the things that I recently did. This is an example of recent activity from a customer relationship management system showing, recent contacts that have been updated. Again, kind of letting me see what my colleagues are doing, but also giving me kind of a history of what's happened here. And this is an example of a recent activity, just kind of a snippet from a dashboard for time management. Where I can see projects that people have recently been charging time to, and it also kind of gives me visibility on how those recent projects are doing financially, how much budget is left, and things like that. News, events, and announcements. So in this area, it's usually not something that end users are coming to a dashboard for. I think oftentimes users going to a dashboard are going to be focused on their task, and they may overlook news stuff unless they have a particular need for it. But I do find that a lot of companies really want to use the dashboard as a way to promote information that they want their customers to see. So there's a little bit of an imbalance there if the users aren't really looking for it, but the companies want to put it there. Sometimes it's the best communication vehicle they have. Sometimes they're not really going to have other frequent contact with these end users. And so if they're promoting something, if there's a new release coming out, if there's some other message they want to get to their customers, they want to get it out there. This is an example from Harvest. It's a timekeeping system showing, there's dashboard stuff here, and then there's kind of a news column on the side. I see that pattern a lot. And here's one that we worked on where we kind of picked regions of the screen to show different types of news and events. So across the top, we have an important system announcement. On the side, there's some other types of news, kind of placeholder areas if the client wants to populate that. And then kind of at the bottom, there's events and contact information and things like that. So various ways that you can kind of wrap the dashboard area, the main area that the user is focused on, with some information that they might or might not need. And there's also types of push content. So in addition to those news items that I mentioned, of course, we see advertising sometimes. This is an example, I believe, from Mint of, there's an ad for a credit card here. It's placed in the context of something that the user's looking at. We also see things that aren't really advertising, but more educational. So if I'm on a financial related website, I might see a thing kind of upselling or educating me on some other things that I might want to do with my funds. A place where I can go to learn more or to start using a new tool that I haven't tried before. There's also various types of help that we find as push content in dashboards. I probably would minimize the amount of this, but depending on the system, there may be a need for some kind of end user training or support, and so this dashboard may be a good place to put at least a starting point to that, keeping the text minimal. So those are the 10 patterns. Before I move on, so after this I'm going to talk a little bit more about the things to keep in mind as we're designing dashboards. But before I do that, I wonder if there's any questions or comments or things that we should talk about here. Yes? Uh-huh. Right, so the question is the news and announcements. I sounded as though I wasn't really in favor of that. I guess just because I've seen the disconnect between clients really wanting to communicate something and users kind of ignoring it. So because I've seen that before, I feel like it's maybe an imperfect way to communicate with people, and maybe the clients who have that desire to communicate might want to try some other vehicles for communication as well. But that said, if they're not getting in the way of the user's task, I don't really see any harm in it either. So I would just try to be thoughtful about where to position that in in the overall layout of the dashboard so that it's not going to negatively impact the user. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
I hope this isn't too granular.
Sure.
But I noticed in one of your first slides you're talking about prioritization.
Yeah.
The second level of priority, you had a column on the right hand versus the left. Have you seen studies that you come to determine best practices? Is that being better as second priority?
Right versus left. Well, I've seen some of the eye tracking studies, and you probably have too, right, where they kind of start reading at the top of the page and then they stay a little bit more down the left side and don't read all the way over to the right side, at least unless there's something really attention-getting. Sometimes you can grab attention further over on the right through the use of color or something like that. So I guess that would, keeping that in mind would lead me to think about, okay, so the tasks that they most need to pay attention to, I would probably be putting on the left. Yeah. And I don't really consider the news to be in that category. Yeah. And of course, things at the top too, like if there's that critical announcement that or some kind of critical warning, I guess I would put that at the top and try to not make it look like an ad because of banner blindness. All right. What else? I think I saw somebody else. All right. Well, let's go ahead and move on to the next section then, which is how do we ensure a good user experience for dashboards? So I've got a few things here that I recommend. The first one being answer meaningful questions. And I guess I would kind of piggyback on what Susan Dray was, her famous quote, if it doesn't, what is it? If it doesn't work for the user, it doesn't work. If it doesn't answer meaningful questions, it's not a good dashboard. So, I mean, even if everything else about it is great, this would be a major stumbling block. So how do we know if these are meaningful questions? Well, I think you know the answer to that. Who is the user? What are they responsible for? What do they need to know? So all of the things that we take as best practices in user-centered design are going to be very important in obviously feeding this. And also think about what's going to be a problem for them if it does not go well. And so that kind of leads us to some of the things that ought to bubble up as alerts for this audience. So, if this user is, an operations manager, she may need to know things like staffing levels. She may need to know how much work are my people doing and are they keeping up with their quotas and stuff like that. And if she's, a director of sales, she may be concerned about what are our revenues and is this better than last year or worse and things like that. So whatever that is for the target audience is super important to know. And of course, we learn that by doing user research. So I hope everybody here has gone to some really good sessions over the past couple of days about user research techniques. I really think there's no greater way to get information than by talking to the users, whether that's through interviews, observations, usability testing, where you can see them interacting with something, super important to do. And I would also just mention that organizational values are an important aspect of this. So it's not just what does the user want, but what's important to that business. So if this is an enterprise application, the things that are important to the business are going to be whatever keeps their customers, whatever makes their money, whatever, the critical things that are success or failure for that business. And, in a more of a SaaS application, it might be the things that are differentiators for this product or the things that are going to keep our customers, using this product and putting in revenue for us. So organizational values, you learn these by talking with stakeholders and prioritizing things with stakeholders. And so this is kind of just representing the idea of gathering that information and sorting it and figuring out what's the key things that it has to accomplish for the organization in terms of business goals. Exception management is an important role that dashboards play. So at least in some business contexts, when everything's going fine, there's really not that much that the dashboard needs to do. But if there's a problem, it has to rise to the surface. And so getting that visibility on something that might otherwise slip by is a super important thing that we need to do for people through the dashboard. This is an example from it's a wireframe from a network security system where, you know, the most important thing for a network security person is to know if there's some kind of a problem, if there's, you know, malware, or if there's a virus going around or something like that. That's something that they have to know. What's the impact of that? How much is it affecting their stuff? What's the criticality of it? That kind of thing. Providing relevant role-based views. So in dashboards, you know, we've got to meet the user needs, and as you know, there are going to be some people with different responsibilities than others. So for example, in our learning management system, you've got a learner who maybe comes in, say, a few times a year to take a class, or, you know, maybe because they're required to do something for certification. And then you've got an instructor who's there every day to enter new content, to check enrollment and things like that. So very different experiences. For an instructor, you know, she's going to need something like this, where there's her draft content that she's working on uploading for new courses, and there's the wait lists of the people who are registered for her courses, and you know, classes that are almost full and classes that might need to be canceled because they're not full, and things like that. So a lot of action items that she needs to do relevant to that workflow. And then the learner's dashboard is going to be more focused on me. It's you know, what am I signed up for? What did I take recently? What's my transcript? So visualization metaphors that fit the type of data. And I'm not going to go very deep into this, but I think it's really important as we work through how to present data to make sure that we're not being misleading, and to make sure that we're accurately conveying the information so that people can quickly and correctly interpret what they're seeing. So metaphors, you know, it's about communication, visual communication. There's an interesting presentation that was done a few weeks ago at the IA Summit that I just wanted to point out here, about taking information and kind of presenting it in a visual space. It touches on this thing about metaphor, and on metaphors that are useful for presenting data. I think you'll find that there are other resources out there too about information visualization that will go deeper in this if you're interested. As a brief example of this, comparison of quantity is something that's good, a good use of bar charts. And this is showing how a bar chart can also include positive and negative values. So just the length of the bar being a clear communicator. There's things like this, which are the relative proportion of things in a stacked bar chart, letting you kind of compare those across different dimensions. Progress towards a goal is something that we see in dashboards a lot. It can be just a simple bar. It can be the circular bar that we see a lot these days. The old-fashioned way of doing that was kind of the thermometer with the goal at the top. Trends over time are handled really well with a line graph. So, you know, when you have time across the bottom, you have whatever the quantity is you're measuring on the vertical axis. And when you're doing charts over time, make sure you label the time periods, and also make sure that you give people the ability to kind of switch the time period if they need to, because the question that they have might not be relevant to this period but to another one. Activity over time is you know, a slightly different thing. It's taking segments of time, whether that's hours, which we see on the top, or days, which we see on the bottom, and indicating the degree of activity or the amount of money or something like that that's over that particular time period. Percentages are displayed well as pie charts. I find that people kind of overuse pie charts sometimes, but percentages are the best way to use them. And of course, the donut chart is kind of a variation on the pie. Tables versus graphs. So sometimes I see dashboards that contain like a huge, dense pattern of tables. And when you get a lot of tables together in one place, they get very hard to read. And so I would kind of encourage you to think about, are there some that could be displayed better in another way, in a more visual way, maybe eliminating a few data points and giving it a more graphical appearance. And not everything is suited to graphics, but this would be an example of where, if you've got a dashboard that looks like this, to try to start taking some parts of it and moving them out into a visual display. Sometimes in particular industries, there are metaphors that people really resonate with. And I found this in the transportation industry, that people like gauges. They like these things that come from, trains and planes and tractors and stuff like that. Anyway, so they want to visualize things as gauges, even if the data is not something that I personally would recommend doing that way. If that's a meaningful display for them, then I guess I would go with it. There's also this thing about fads, and I like these things too, so I'm not knocking this display. I think this is a great display. I use it myself, but it's not going to be relevant for every circumstance. So, I had a situation a few months ago with a client who wanted to take test data, which is like certification tests where you're being measured in all these different skill areas, and display it in this round chart, and it was going to end up looking something like this. And I just felt like we're going too far. We really don't want to use it for that because it's becoming very difficult to read. So so even though round circular graphs are cool, they may not work for everything. Sensitive information. So sometimes the information we want to put in a dashboard for whatever reason is going to be kind of personally difficult for people. So in this example, it's a dashboard for a health risk assessment where people are answering questions about their medical history and conditions and things. And if you're going to give people information back that says, you have a high risk of cancer or something like that, that's a whole different thing than you have a high probability of meeting your sales goals. So the emotional meaning of this information is something that you don't want to display graphically in a cavalier way. It may be something that you handle a little bit better through words and pictures and things like that in addition to the numbers. I also recall an interesting situation where there was a dashboard for a group of users who have a daily quota of production stuff that they need to meet, and they really wanted to go in and see how they're doing on their accounts, but they also get measured on quality, and quality was a really sensitive subject for them. Like, they really didn't want to see the quality information every day when they log in, so because it made them feel bad if they had made a mistake, and so it's not like they didn't want the information at all, but they really didn't want it in their face all the time. So I think it's interesting to kind of work through how your users feel about the information as one input to how it gets displayed. All right, so balancing roll-ups versus instance level. So instance level means like each item in the list is its own thing. It's to-do items or invoices or whatever you've got a list of, whereas a roll-up is an aggregate. And what I find is that you can't reasonably show very many instance level items in a dashboard. A dashboard is better suited to roll-ups most of the time. Like in this example where we've got the 193 alerts, or you've got 137 open cases. It's going to be hard to page through each of these. A roll-up view would be a lot easier to absorb. This is kind of a roll-up view where it's a workflow management system, and you can click on something like new cases and see them listed below. But sometimes here too, you run into a risk of having too many categories. So think about categories and their meaning. This is an example of a roll-up from a thing that had to do with sports injuries. So, if a player gets injured in a football practice or something, how that would impact them. They were trying to track this information, but they were rolling it up by date. And there's actually probably more important questions that could be answered with this data than what date did it happen, right? It's probably more like what kind of injuries are prevalent, or how many injuries has this person had, which people have had the most injuries, things like that would be a better way to roll up that data. Instance level data works when there's only a few things. So in this case, my recent payments. If I've only got maybe 3 or 4 recent payments, it's good to display them. That saves me a step because I can see the information there without going somewhere else. If I had 100 recent payments, that might be a problem. So scalability comes into play. An example of a roll-up here is for an executive looking at the workflow in their organization. They can see a chart at the top. The donut chart shows how many cases are overdue or coming due, and then each office that they oversee. This executive is important one of their main concerns is making sure that work gets done on time. So if any work is late, they really want to know about it, and they want to be able to drill down and find out more. So you can click on an office and see the people in it as well to see like who's contributing to this lateness factor. Prioritize and eliminate unnecessary details. So I threw this in because I was sitting on the airplane looking at this display, and it made me think about prioritizing, because once I'm already on the flight, I really don't need to know the flight number anymore. It actually, what I'm most interested in at this point on my journey is, when am I going to get there? How much longer is it going to take? So as I was looking at this, I was thinking it's relevant to think about what's a priority, and does that change over time? While I was at the airport, it would have been really useful to know what the flight number was, right? But my priorities change as time goes on. And of course, one way to deal with this prioritization thing is that you start removing data that doesn't absolutely need to be there, but you provide it on hover or on click. So like in this chart, this is a very nice clean chart. It would be very cluttery if we tried to label all those points, but you don't need to, because you can hover over them, or you can click on them for more information. And here's an example, too, of hovering over a bar and getting some more detail. And of course, when users are interacting with something like this on a dashboard, they usually have a question. They usually want to know why. They're looking at something and saying, now that doesn't look right. I wonder what happened there. And they want to be able to drill down, so make sure that everything is as interactive as it can be, so that they can get those answers. All right, give users or clients some control over their display. Not always, but configuration is an important thing, and especially for SaaS applications that get used in a wide variety of different companies. We work with a lot of applications that are highly configurable, and either by the user or by the company that buys them, or both. In this example, I was just thinking about how that invoice summary section of the screen is always showing zeros, because I don't use the invoice feature in this tool, and it would be really nice if I could turn it off. We tend to design dashboards where there are maybe modules on the dashboard that the user can turn on and off. And this is kind of a wireframe example of that, where people can pick certain things. And of course, this can also be done at the client level, right? If a client has bought certain modules of your product and not others, turning those off and making sure that the dashboard scales well if that item isn't there is a very important consideration. This is an example where every section in the dashboard is configurable by the user. There's a little gear icon in each one of them, so that the user, this is a fitness kind of application, they can pick the bike rides that they want, the area that they want, they can set up their calendar, things like that, so it makes it very personal to them. Google Analytics is a good example of something that's highly configurable. People that use this say that it's really easy to create new dashboards and widgets in it. So you kind of keep adding the things that you're interested in making. A client configuration example, this is a little bit of a confusing one, but in this transportation software that I was talking about, different companies have different workflows. And so, here it's trying to help users do something that's in their workflow, but because every company has different steps, this actually has to be all client configurable. So it's driven off of reports that the administrator sets up in this organization, each organization that buys this. And they define their own, activities, their own roll-up step, and then it gets populated with the data about the outstanding items that fit those categories. Of course, dashboards need to be accessible and responsive, and I'm kind of grouping those two things together because, they're both about performing well in a different context. So as our context changes, as we go into a different place or we try to use it with a different set of assistive devices, we want to make sure that things perform as well as possible. So for accessibility, this is kind of excerpted from a talk that I gave jointly with Marguerite Bergel a couple years ago. We talked about things like readability, making sure that the font size can be configured by the user, making sure you have redundant cues for color blindness so that it's not relying on color alone. having good contrast. Those are all things for users who just need a little bit of additional help viewing the screen. And then you've got other things, supporting all input methods is important, and making sure that you're using standard semantic structure in the coding, because this is something that the assistive technologies can use to make sure that people can access the information that they're getting. So don't override things like pinch and zoom, and don't hard code fonts, because that makes it more challenging for the assistive technology to do its job. Keep it simple, relevant, and timely when you're dealing with responsiveness, taking an app that's fairly complex and creating a mobile version of it. You do have to ask, what are people really going to do on mobile? And they might not really be using all the features of your product on the mobile platform. There may be some that are much more important than others. And there may also be some that are enhanced by the location awareness that we can get in a mobile platform. So sometimes sometimes responsiveness is about scaling, so it's about taking that layout and making it work at smaller and smaller sizes. But sometimes it's also kind of rethinking that a little bit and thinking about what could and should be different when you're in a mobile situation. This is an example from, it's actually an Apple Watch for a system administrator who's interested in if there are any problems on the network. And you can see that this is going to be a lot more condensed than what that system administrator would likely be seeing if they were at their desk. But I think it's really good that it does focus them on the key thing they need to know, which is, is there anything wrong? Is there a system down somewhere that I need to respond to? And even at that small size, they can still get that information. Plan for scalability and full life cycle. This is my last point. So scalability. So for a first-time user, and I talked about first-time users a couple days ago. This was an example I showed in that talk, and I brought it over here because I think it's relevant here too. So if you've got a user who doesn't have a particular type of information, maybe because they're using the system for the first time, or maybe because they just don't have that type of data, it's useful for our dashboards to scale appropriately to support them. So in the top, these are actually two screenshots of the same thing. In the top one, it's showing this user has a number of different types of financial accounts. They've got holding accounts, forwards, and orders. And in the bottom one, they don't have the forwards and orders. But we don't want to just say, nothing there. No data is not really valuable. It would be better to take the opportunity to support them and maybe let them know what's possible, or help them to start creating that kind of thing if they need to. So this is a more useful version of that same screen, where maybe it gives them a reason why this would be useful to them and a starting point to create it. No data is a problem that I see a lot on dashboards, not only for the first-time user, but just in general going forward. This is one of my pet peeves from Rally, which is a tool that I use periodically in software development. And I find myself in situations sometimes where there's nothing found, nothing found, nothing found, and I scroll down the page and there's still nothing, nothing, nothing. So I feel like we should do a better job of thinking about what's going to happen when there is no data, and how can this scale more effectively to reflect the range of possibilities, whether there's no data, some data, a lot of data. It can change the display, it can change the visualization, and maybe we need to work harder at adaptive interfaces that deal with this better. There's also the idea of evolving over time. So, this is a screenshot from a fundraising application, and it's got some stuff at the bottom about, and you probably can't read it from there, but it says some things like, here's how to start your fundraising campaign and stuff like that. But the kind of annoying thing is that it's always there. So even after you've been using this for years, it's still there. It would be nice if that was kind of at the top when you were new, and you could read through it. Maybe it could show you a few things, and then you could dismiss it, instead of it hanging around all the time. But over time, what you need here may change. Maybe you've done more and more fundraising campaigns, and you want to be able to go back and see them, or you want to compare this one with another one, or things like that are only possible when you've got a lot more data in the system. So again, I think there's an opportunity here to help dashboards grow with their users. And that's the 8 principles. Okay, so I think I'm done, and we've got a few minutes left for questions. Oh, I did forget to mention that there is okay, so these slides are posted on my website. And also there's a survey. If you fill out the survey, this is session number 67, which it says at the bottom. Okay, sorry. So were there questions? Yes.
We've been told not to put like functionality on a dashboard, that it should be more just for presenting information.
Mm-hmm.
But you had that example of the Dropbox,
Mm-hmm.
or drop the invoice on there. Are there
Yeah.
any thoughts on that, or what other examples you have of functionality that's suited for a dashboard?
Okay, so the question is about functionality on a dashboard, and are there times when it's appropriate to put functionality, like that drag and drop example that I showed? And yes, I think it really depends on if there's an important task that you know people are going there for, then instead of making them drill down a level to it, it would be nice to put it there. But just remember that it has to be, you can't start putting everything there, right? So it's the prioritization question that comes up. But I think it's a great idea if there's a particular task that you know people are coming for. And sometimes it's search tasks that are like that, like something that you know they're coming to look up in the dashboard. I don't know, does anybody else have an example of functionality that goes on the dashboard? Yes. Print. Did you say printing? Yeah. Okay, yeah. So you mean like if there's graphs on the dashboard and you want to print those out or maybe download or export or?
Or a list.
Yeah.
Something where it's a cumulative thing and you have to go away from the monitor back to it to grab those supplies. You have to go away. It'd be nice
Right.
if you could print that list that's on that screen.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So being able to print things right from there, yes. Calculators, yeah, that's a good one. Well, in fact, the currency conversion is another functionality thing that I think I showed on one of those dashboards, right? It's, if we know users are coming there for that, then instead of having them click on the currency converter and go to another page, let's show it right there. Yeah, good one. Okay, what other questions are there? Or comments? Yes?
So you referenced evolution and change and adaptability.
Right.
Would you say there's a best practice around permissions, or is it something that you typically make recommendations without permissions on? Do you always afford the opportunity to make those switches or changes within configuration, or is it more commonly?
Are you talking about user configuration particularly? Yeah, like having maybe certain people who have the permission to make those changes and other people who don't, yeah. I think that's a good point. I think, sometimes with SaaS applications, it's more the person who's responsible for configuring it in that organization who makes a lot of those changes. And then, there may be things that end users can add, but they can't really overrule what the administrator did. So you can kind of think of it as tiers of permissions, where there's a bit of a hierarchy there. It's also true that a lot of users don't bother to configure things even when they can, so you've got to think about good defaults and, having things set up in a way that it's going to work fine for people even if they don't do that. You see that more from, people who spend every day in the system may be more likely to configure than those who don't. Yes?
Speaking of configuration and shipping defaults, what's your take on, do you turn everything on, do you turn everything off?
Oh, turn everything on or off. So when you say everything, what do you mean?
Most commonly used by your intended audience may be on.
Yeah. Huh. So he's asking about, if people can configure things, where do you start? Do you start with everything off, everything on, or some kind of combination? I kind of think I'd like to have a middle ground, actually, because, you start with everything on, and that might be a little overwhelming for some people. So I think it's probably a matter of finding a good middle ground that a lot of people can live with. Yes?
If I could add to that.
Yeah.
It really has to do with your users, right? If you know that your users map to a certain skill level, proficiency, if they're going to value a lot of functionality,
Right.
then you give them the kitchen sink. Otherwise, there could be lower levels of configuration.
Right. So if you know your users are good with having a lot of information, give it to them. Yeah. That's a good suggestion. Anybody else? Yes?
One more point on that. The other thing is we're seeing a lot of the use of animations, and
Oh, yeah, that's a good example.
That way there's awareness that there's something they can bring in or remove, and the fact that they can control that.
Right, so this is a point about animations, that sometimes you can use animations to educate the user, to show them that there's something there on the screen, but then kind of let it, you know, hide or minimize.
Let those behaviors drive the kind of do that.
Right, exactly, and that's a nice idea, because that way it's not going to be always on, but you know, there's the risk if you don't turn it on that they never know it's there, right? So the animation might help take care of that. Okay, I think we're at the end of our time, so I'll be here for a little while longer if anybody wants to talk. Enjoy the rest of your day.